Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Carter Krishnaiyer.
And I'm Robert Buccellato.
So, Robert, last week you talked a little bit about Governor Leroy Collins and his governorship. I want to take a broader overview of the man, the Floridian of the century, as he was named, 20th century, obviously, in this podcast this week.
A man who transformed this state and also a man who prevented Florida from going the way of Alabama or Mississippi in the 1950s. Florida very easily could have gone in that direction. It was a state run by the pork chop gang. It was a state that had actually more per capita lynchings than any other state in the country from 1901 to 1950. It was a state whose legislature, as we mentioned, was run by the pork chop gang, but was also heavily dominated by rural segregationists. It was a state that could have gone in a radically different direction, but one man in particular saved that from happening. Florida was a state with a poisoned racial culture. It was a state dominated by Jeffersonian Democrats who were largely rural and segregationist. And with what the legislatures in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia were doing, Florida was in competition with those states to pass the most reprehensible anti-civil rights, pro-segregation, pro-racial violence in some case legislation. And Leroy Collins was the effective check on that happening in the state of Florida.
Yeah, and this week we decided, because we do often talk about him in the context of his time as governor, but this week we thought it would be a good idea to talk more about his post-governorship, in which he was really a major figure in the civil rights movement and in places like Selma. And he's really become a figure that, for whatever reason, seems to be omitted in a lot of the tellings of these events. But nevertheless, they're not often what people would normally associate with Leroy Collins. They are very important moments in his time as a public servant, and even in terms of his evolution as a man in terms of race and prejudice.
So let's talk about Collins a little bit. He wins in 54 against the infamous Charlie Johnson. I should mention the Johns Committee was actually a forerunner of the infamous Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, Johns Committee, which we've talked about previously on this show, which was a shameful episode in Florida's legislative history. So Florida maybe even was more radicalized than Mississippi and Alabama in 1955. But in 54, Collins wins. In 56, he gets reelected, defeating a bunch of candidates in the Democratic primary, including the segregationist Sumter Lowry, whose name is on the Lowry Park Zoo in Tampa. 1960, the winner of the governor's race, Collins cannot run for another term, is Ferris Bryant, who had been Speaker of the House, who was from Ocala, who had been in alliance with the pork chop gang, and who was a segregationist, a staunch segregationist. And actually, before we move on, I want to mention that Sumter Lowry, who I just mentioned as a segregationist, was more than a segregationist. He was an out-and-out racist with some of the most violently racist vocabulary in his campaign speeches, in his campaign rhetoric, even in his campaign literature, and talking about communist plots and all sorts of horrible other connotations connected to his racism. Florida had violent racists like that at the time, and Lowry was certainly one of the most violent of them, but that was I don't want to call it mainstream ideology in Florida, but it was not as much of a fringe ideology as we would like to think. So anyway, Robert, walk us through the next few years after Collins leaves the governor's mansion, because he becomes a figure that becomes offensive to a large number of Florida Democrats who are still fighting to maintain segregation, who are still very conservative, very Jeffersonian in their worldview. Collins is someone who was very comfortable with urbane interests, spent a lot of time in South Florida, was very popular in Miami, in Dade County. And as the 1960s began, Collins's ideology and Collins's role in American society was radically different than the establishment of the Florida Democratic Party at the time. Though I have to say, one of the things that bothers me is Collins is a man ahead of his time. Collins is a man taking courageous stands as a politician from the South, as a politician from Florida, as a Democrat from Florida, yet he's never quite gotten the adulation or accolades from the liberals that I believe he deserves.
Well, so you had mentioned his run for re-election. And it's important to note that because he had come in sort of an abbreviated term to finish the remaining year and some change of his good friend Dan McCarty, who passed away, he was able to technically succeed himself to a 4-year term. And he did it overwhelmingly. It was just an unparalleled victory for him in both the primary and then the runoff and the national election. The general election. From that point on, politically, for this man, it's downhill, and it's downhill fast. He was dabbling a little bit in national politics with the Democratic Party. He was the chairman of the 1960 Democratic National Convention. He was talked about as possibly a vice presidential candidate or as a cabinet position. He was really, as time went on, he was going so far ahead of what his base of supporters dreamed of doing in terms of race, in terms of civil rights. This was a man who might have been a reformer, but a huge part of his appeal was not from those that you would now consider to be, I don't want to say that they would be racist, but they clearly were people that were
arch segregationists.
They were very sympathetic to the system of segregation. And so as he went further and further trying to moderate the conflicts that were taking place, because all throughout the South, including Florida, there were demonstrations, and they could have gotten a lot more violent than they did, but he called on the state to come together for those that are more moderate in their views to sort of stand up and not be silent, to really kind of moderate both the activists and those that had for so long been against civil rights. So he did that in the late 1950s. By the time he leaves office, he's basically estranged from the entire Florida Democratic Party, the legislators, and even most of his supporters. He doesn't get a position right away in the Kennedy administration. He actually, for a few years, is the head of a national television and film lobby, the largest in the country. And he went about sort of trying to reform the code and really take actions to sort of deregulate the holdings that studios had. He then is asked to join the LBJ administration, first as Deputy Secretary of Commerce, and then LBJ tells him that I want you to take on essentially the lead role, sort of a Secretary of Civil Rights. And he informed him. He said, I want you to do this because I think you are the right man to do this. You come from a southern state. You used to have not very progressive ideals about race, and you have reformed yourself. And I want you to do this, but just note that it's going to be horrible for you politically. And that's what he did. And it was horribly political unpopular for him. He was largely responsible for ensuring that the events in Selma didn't turn into a bloodbath. He was personally responsible for coming up with a settlement between the National Guard and Martin Luther King Jr., and he even outlined in inches how far they could go on the bridge, pray, and turn around without basically getting killed by the National Guard. So he did all of that. There's pictures of him right next to Martin Luther King and Andrew Young and a lot of the other figures that we've come to know. And then he gets an idea in his head that he's going to run for U.S. Senate in 1968. And to his shock and frustration, when he starts making the rounds, which, anybody who runs for office or thinks about running for office, first thing you do is you do the rounds. You call up all your friends, you call up your family, your existing baked-in base of supporters, and see if they would be interested, if they would want to volunteer, if they'd want to show, you around to their families, their groups, and host you for parties. And to his astonishment, almost none of them wanted to, because he was at Selma. They said that they loved him as governor, but that they didn't like his politics now. And famously, when his pick to run for governor in 1960, who was
Doyle Carlton, right?
Yeah, Doyle Carlton. Thank you. He said to him famously, he said, "I can't give you my friends. I can only give you my enemies." And so that, we kind of think of him now as this great mythical figure in the Florida governorship, but he was, totally and utterly disliked by so many circles of this state by the time he left office, and it just kept getting worse and worse for him. He was able to get the Democratic nomination in the Senate race, and then he got annihilated.
But he barely got the Democratic nomination.
Yes, he barely got it.
Earl Fairclough, and should mention George Smathers, who we've talked about not so favorably on this show in the past, according to some of our listeners. That seems to be a bone of contention for some of y'all out there. It was Smathers' seat. Smathers was so hostile to Collins, and so hostile, quite frankly, to Collins' position on race and law and order and all these code words that became important in 68, that he considered unretiring so Collins wouldn't be nominated, and Collins wouldn't take his seat.
Yeah, and it's really one of those things where he went from the start of his life, both as a lawyer and then as a legislator, as really being a man of his time. And then he went from his governorship, you see this sort of evolution from the sort of comfort that many people had with choosing to be blind to what was going on, or not even be blind, just deciding not to get involved and really being guilty in their silence, to essentially being transformed into this person that transcended his office and was despised by his contemporaries, but really became a Floridian for Floridians that weren't born yet. And so you have this this very unusual situation where he's left for political dead by 1968, but by 1980 or 1976, if he wanted to, he could run for U.S. Senator or even governor again, and he wouldn't have a primary. So that just shows you how quickly the whole views of various civil rights issues and busing and segregation really became main staples by the 1970s and then early 80s. And you really saw a turning point. This defeat of Leroy Collins, this embrace by the Republicans of the Southern strategy, worked very well for them for, 68 and 72, but then it started to kind of, you'd see this pushback. The state Democrats were becoming more moderate because of reapportionment. So as a result, somebody like Leroy Collins became very fashionable again.
Yeah, and obviously African Americans were eligible to vote in the Democratic primary and in the general election in 1968. The few African Americans that had been able to vote in Florida, that had not been disenfranchised by poll taxes and other means, violence, the Ocoee Massacre, things like that previously, had generally been Republicans. But African Americans able to vote in 68 in Florida in mass, and that also kind of changes the dynamics. Anyway, Robert, thank you. You'll be back with us next week, and we will talk to you again real soon on the Florida History Podcast.